In 2010, an explorer named Jeff, a guy who was really passionate about caving, decided to take a trip to Madagascar. This wasn't just a vacation for him. He had a very specific goal in mind. Years earlier, on a previous trip, he had stumbled across a natural cave shaft, a deep hole in the ground that just seemed to call out to him. He'd made notes about it, logged its location, and had been dreaming about coming back to properly explore it ever since. For a caver like Jeff, an unexplored shaft is like an unsolved mystery, and he was finally ready to go find some answers. So, he flies into Madagascar, goes through all the usual travel motions, and gets himself a rental car. He knew the general area where the cave was, but it was remote, not the kind of place you just plug into a GPS. He needed local knowledge to get close, so he hired a guide, a man from a nearby village, to take him out into the wilderness. After a long and bumpy drive, they finally arrived in the region Jeff recognized from his last trip. He pulled out his old, worn notebook, flipping through the pages until he found his hand-drawn maps and coordinates. He used those notes to pinpoint the exact location, and sure enough, there it was. A dark, narrow opening in the earth, about a meter across, just as he remembered it. He paid the guide for his time and asked him to wait by the car. He tried to reassure the man, telling him he wouldn't be gone for a very long time. The plan was simple: rappel down, check out the bottom, and come straight back up. The guide just sort of nodded, probably thinking this foreigner was a little crazy for wanting to go down a hole in the middle of nowhere. Jeff laid out all his gear. He was meticulous, a professional. He had his ropes, his harness, his helmet with a headlamp, and his backpack. Inside that backpack was his technical ascending gear, the specialized equipment he would need to climb back up the rope. The shaft itself was about 50 meters deep. That's over 160 feet. The first 20 meters or so were on a bit of an angle, a steep slide downwards. But after that, the final 30 meters were a straight, vertical drop into blackness. From what Jeff could tell, there was a small chamber at the bottom, just big enough to stand up and walk around in, but there were no other tunnels leading off from it. This was a simple in-and-out job. Go down, touch the bottom, come back up. One of the challenges of a shaft like this is the visibility. The opening was so narrow that as soon as Jeff started his descent, his own body would block most of the sunlight. A few meters down, he'd be relying completely on his headlamp to see. With his gear checked and his rope secured, he gave the guide a final wave and started his descent. He moved slowly and confidently, the rough rock walls brushing against him as he made his way down the first 20 meters of the angled slope. Everything was going perfectly. He reached the 20-meter mark, the point where the shaft transitioned from an angle to a straight vertical drop. He paused for a moment, adjusting his position on the rope, getting ready for the final 30-meter descent into the darkness below. And that's when he saw something. Just a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye right at the edge of his headlamp's beam. He instinctively turned his head, focusing the light on the wall of the shaft to get a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. The wall was moving. It was covered in thousands of tiny, black, shiny bodies scattering away from the light. They were black widow spiders. Thousands upon thousands of them. He swung his light around, and his heart hammered in his chest. The entire vertical section of the shaft, from where he was hanging all the way down to the bottom, was a living, moving carpet of black widows. He was frozen in place, suspended on a rope 30 meters above the bottom of the cave, completely surrounded by one of the most venomous spiders in the world. His first instinct, his only instinct, was to get out. He wanted to stop right there, turn around, and climb back up to the surface as fast as he possibly could. But he couldn't. And that was the real problem. To go back up the rope he was currently on, he needed his ascending gear. And his ascending gear was packed away neatly and safely inside his backpack, which was strapped to his back. Trying to swing around, take his pack off, fish out the gear, and set it up while dangling in the middle of a spider-infested shaft would be incredibly dangerous. It was a recipe for a fatal fall. So he was trapped. He had only one option, and it was the last thing in the world he wanted to do. He had to continue his descent. He had to go down the final 30 meters right through the heart of the spider nest to reach the bottom of the cave. Only then could he safely take his pack off, get his gear out, and begin the climb back up. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked down into the darkness, knowing what was waiting for him. And then he began his slow, awful descent. With every meter he lowered himself, the reality of his situation became more intense. Periodically, his body would bump against the wall, and he'd hear the sickening rustle of thousands of spiders scattering around him. He could feel them. He saw them climbing onto the sleeves of his shirt, and he'd have to brush them off, trying not to panic. He saw them on the rope itself right above his hands, and he'd frantically try to knock them away before he had to grab that section of rope. It was a living nightmare. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his feet touched the solid ground at the bottom of the shaft. He was standing in the small chamber, but he was far from safe. He could hear the spiders all around him, a constant, quiet crawling sound on the walls. He quickly shrugged off his backpack and shone his light on it. It was covered in spiders. He carefully unzipped it, and more spiders crawled out from inside. He had to reach in, carefully pushing past the spiders, to pull out his ascending gear. Once he had it, he didn't waste a second. He threw his pack back on, attached the gear to the rope, and began making his way back up. The whole time, he was in a constant battle, brushing spiders off his clothes, his gear, his body. It was a slow and terrifying climb, but the growing circle of light from the entrance above him gave him strength. Finally, he pulled himself over the edge and collapsed onto the ground, back in the sunlight, back in the fresh air. The first thing he did, without even thinking, was strip off all his clothing. He had to get any remaining spiders off of him. He shook out his shirt, his pants, everything. He took his bag, turned it upside down, and dumped everything out. More spiders fell to the ground. You can only imagine what the guide was thinking, just sitting by the car, watching this foreigner emerge from a hole in the ground and immediately start taking all his clothes off. But Jeff didn't care. After he was sure he was spider-free, he got dressed again. He walked over to the car, and the guide just looked at him, not saying a word. Miraculously, Jeff hadn't been bitten a single time. As they started the long drive back towards the city, Jeff took out his notebook. He found the page for this particular cave. The name he had originally given it from his first visit was the Crooked Tube. He took his pen and scratched that name out with a thick, angry line. And above it, in big, clear letters, he wrote a new name, The Entrance to Hell. Back in 2006, a 14-year-old boy named Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. But this wasn't your typical farm with cows and cornfields. It was a pine tree farm. His family's business was harvesting and baling pine straw, which is a big commodity in the landscaping world. Their house was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly planted pine trees, lined up in neat, endless rows. They were totally isolated. They didn't have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one long, straight road that led onto the property. From the main house, they could look out and see all the way down that road, right through the rows of trees. This meant it was basically impossible for anyone to visit without being spotted long before they arrived. The house itself was built on a very slight hill. To keep it level, one side of the house was effectively built up on stilts. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. This created a strange effect. If you were in the living room looking out the window, you were actually looking down at the ground at a steep angle. It felt like you were on the second story, even though you were on the first. And the window in that living room was unique. It was huge, stretching almost the entire length of the room, nearly 50 feet across. At night, that window was kind of creepy, because you could see so clearly down the long, straight rows of trees, you'd often see animals darting between the trunks in the darkness. That alone was enough to give you a weird feeling. But it was the size of the window that really got to people. When you were in that room at night, with the lights on inside and pure blackness outside, you just felt incredibly exposed. Like you were on a stage. Between the creepy animals and the feeling of vulnerability, The family basically avoided using the living room at all after the sun went down. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with them for a visit. Since the main house didn't have any extra bedrooms, the only place for the boys to sleep was in the living room. There were 2 couches in there. One was positioned right underneath that giant 50-foot window. The other was on the opposite side of the room, against a solid wall with no window. Evan, being the host, took the couch under the window, and his cousin took the other one. The first night his cousin was there, they tried to make it a little less creepy. They found a big sheet and hung it up over the window, but it wasn't big enough. It only covered about 75% of the glass, leaving the 2 ends of the window, the flanks, totally exposed. Still, it blocked the main view from where their couches were, so it gave them a little sense of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the 2 boys finally fell asleep around midnight. A couple of hours later, they were woken up by the sound of Evan's dogs barking. They were way off in the pine trees, somewhere out in the darkness. Now, Evan was used to his dogs. They were always running around the property, barking at squirrels or raccoons, so the sound of barking itself wasn't a red flag. But this time, the barking didn't stop. It was persistent and had an urgent tone to it. It was so continuous that it eventually made Evan's cousin get up off his couch. He walked across the room to the part of the window that wasn't covered by the sheet, right at the foot of Evan's couch, and peered out into the night. Evan was still lying down. He wasn't about to get up and look out the window himself, so he just watched his cousin's face, trying to get a read on what he was seeing. He noticed his cousin had this really perplexed look. He was squinting his eyes, leaning closer to the glass, like he was trying to make sense of something. So Evan whispered to him, "Hey, what's going on?" "What do you see?" His cousin replied, his voice a little shaky. "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At that, Evan jumped off the couch and ran over to the window, getting right up next to his cousin to see for himself. He scanned the rows of trees. The first thing he noticed was that the moon was very bright that night, and there was a light dusting of snow on the ground which made everything seem to glow. It was actually pretty easy to see. He was looking out, maybe about 100 meters into the woods, when he saw it. Someone's leg extended out from behind one of the pine trees, as if they were about to step into the open space between 2 rows. Evan just stared, his mind racing. He couldn't believe he was seeing a person. Nobody ever came onto their property, especially not in the middle of the night. Then, a body followed the leg. A tall, dark figure walked calmly from one row of trees to the next, disappearing behind another tree. Evan grabbed his cousin's arm. "Did you just see that?" His cousin just nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, I saw that." They continued to stare in the direction where the person had gone. A couple of minutes passed in total silence. Then they saw another leg emerge, going the other way, back towards where the first person had come from. The legs stepped out into the gap, and another tall figure walked across. Except this time, instead of going straight across, it looked like they were moving at a slight angle, an angle that was bringing them closer to the house. The boys looked at each other, not knowing what to do. They were terrified. So they just kept looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they were looking, they saw the person emerge again. Except now, they weren't 100 meters away anymore. They were maybe 20 meters away. They had closed the distance impossibly fast, and the boys hadn't seen them move. This time, when the leg came out from behind the pine tree, the figure didn't walk across the gap. It stopped, right in the middle, in the open. And then, it turned its head and looked directly at the boys in the window. And then, it began to run straight toward them. The boys practically fell over each other trying to get away from the window. Evan started yelling for his father, who was asleep upstairs. Instinctively, the 2 boys just started running around the house, locking every single door, shutting every single window. As they went from door to door, the anxiety was building and building. They were thinking, if I don't get this lock turned fast enough, that person who was running at us is going to come barging right through. At every door, their fear was through the roof. They managed to get everything shut and locked just as Evan's father came charging down the stairs. He had his gun in his hand and he was yelling, "What's going on?" They quickly told him that there was someone on the property. Without hesitating, their dad charged out the front door. The front door wasn't on the same wall as the big living room window. It was on the side of the house. So once he was outside, he had to turn to the right to look out in the direction the boys had described. He stood on the porch and just started yelling into the darkness, screaming at whoever was out there that if they came any closer, he was going to shoot them. He screamed for them to get away from his house. And then there was just silence. The boys waited inside, peering around, checking the window. They didn't see anything. After a minute, their dad came back inside, shut the heavy door, and locked it. He looked at Evan and said, "Keep an eye out. If you see him again, you let me know." Looking back on it later, Evan would say that they really should have called 911 right then. But as a kid, he just understood that that wasn't how his family operated. They took care of things themselves. So even with a strange person running at their house, calling the police just wasn't the first thought. His dad was effectively telling him to be a lookout. So Evan and his cousin went back into the living room. They were apprehensive, but they slowly crept up to the window and looked out. After 5 or 10 minutes of seeing nothing, they started to calm down a little. They reasoned with each other that Evan's dad was a pretty intimidating guy. He had just been outside, screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. They figured the person, or people, probably got the message and were long gone. So the boys got back onto their couches. It took them a long time, but eventually they did fall back asleep. The next morning, when the boys woke up, the first thing they wanted to do was go outside. They needed to see if they could find any footprints. Part of them still thought that maybe they had imagined the whole thing, that their minds were playing tricks on them in the dark. So they went out the front door and walked around the side of the house down into the trees where they had seen the figures. And they found them. Footprints in the light snow. It was a confirmation. Okay, someone was definitely out here. It wasn't them. These weren't their footprints. They started following the tracks back towards the house. And that's when they realized something even more disturbing. At a certain point, they could see that there weren't just one set of footprints. There were two distinct sets. There had been two people out there in the dark. And it got even worse. They followed the two sets of footprints all the way up to the house. And they found two different circles of trampled snow, where the people had been standing for a long time. The footprints stopped right underneath the living room window, one circle on each side, in the exact spots along the flanks of the window where the sheet had not been covering the glass. The horrible realization washed over them. Over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were standing at that window, looking out into the trees, there was a very good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up right against the side of the house in their blind spot. Because of that steep downward angle from the living room window, anyone pressed up against the wall would have been completely invisible. And then, for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into their beds and were sleeping, there were two strangers standing right there, just feet away, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father saw the footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun again and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from. But the snow cover was patchy, and at some point the tracks just disappeared. They never figured out who those two people were. Evan would later say that after that night, his cousin refused to ever come over for a sleepover again. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California. He was visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her place was in a really safe complex. It was gated, there were lights everywhere, cameras, the whole deal. It was the kind of place where if you heard something go bump in the night, you just assumed it was a noisy neighbor or a cat knocking something over. It wasn't a place you worried about. On the last night of his stay, Nathan was lying in bed in the guest room. He was listening to the familiar, comforting sounds of the night, the low hum of the street lamp just outside his window, the chirping of crickets, and the distant sound of cars passing by on the main road. He drifted off to sleep to that gentle soundtrack. At about 2 a.m, Nathan woke up. Or at least, he thought he woke up. He found that he couldn't move his body at all. He could move his eyes, darting them around the room, but the rest of him was completely paralyzed. He had never experienced sleep paralysis before, but instinctively, he understood that this must be what it was. He also noticed that the room was completely silent. The hum of the street lamp was gone. The crickets were quiet. There was no more traffic noise. Just total unnerving silence. He started flashing his eyes around the room, trying to take stock of his surroundings since he couldn't move his head. The bed he was in was positioned in the back right corner, as far away from the door as possible. From where he was lying, if he looked to his right, in the corner there was a big, heavy armoire. As he scanned his eyes to the left from the armoire, he came to the bedroom door, which was on the opposite side of the room from his bed. If he kept scanning left, his eyes would reach the foot of his bed. And just beyond the foot of his bed, he knew there was a small table and a chair. But because he was lying flat on his back, he couldn't actually see that part of the room. With all the strength he could muster, he managed to raise his head just a few inches off the pillow, just enough so he could get a line of sight to that one section of the room he hadn't been able to see yet. He saw the table and the chair. And he saw, standing in the corner next to them, a dark figure. It was just standing there, looking at him. He was completely frozen with fear. His first thought was that there was an intruder in the house. How did they get in? What were they doing in his room? He managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure. He determined it was most likely a woman, and she had a shawl or a veil covering her face. And then, just before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of his view. Nathan's head fell back, and now he was just lying there, paralyzed, knowing there was a stranger in his room. He couldn't lift his head anymore. He was staring at the ceiling, looking around with his eyes, seeing the armoire, seeing the door, but unable to see the corner where she was. And then he heard a sound. It was the sound of someone slithering along the ground just out of his sight. He could hear her breathing. And she was getting closer and closer to the edge of his bed. He was lying there, absolutely terrified, so scared he couldn't even make a sound. He kept telling himself, "This has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up." And then, this woman, she stood up, she leaned out over his bed and looked down at him. Her face was pale, almost white, and her eyes were dark and sunk way back in her head. Then she began to slowly crawl on top of him. Nathan was just staring up at her. He wanted to close his eyes, to look away, but he couldn't. He just felt his chest being pressed down, the weight of her on him. He could hear the sounds of the mattress springs compressing all around him as this woman positioned herself on his chest. And then finally, he managed to let out a scream. And just like that, he was awake. The woman was gone. He shot up in bed, looking around frantically. There was nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the street lamp and the sound of the crickets and the traffic outside all returned at once. His mom came running into the room. "Hey, are you okay?" "I heard screaming in here." He was still catching his breath. "Oh, no. I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." His mom looked at him, concerned. "Okay, all right. You need anything?" He shook his head. "Nope." So she came over, gave him a hug and a kiss, and went back to her own bed. Nathan, however, couldn't go back to sleep. He went downstairs, flipped on the TV, and put on a Disney movie, Aladdin. He fell asleep on the couch with the movie and all the lights on. He didn't have any more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and headed back to his own house. But he couldn't shake the experience. It was so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. He just kept thinking to himself, "I can't believe there are people who put up with this on a regular basis." But, after a couple of days of being home and not experiencing it again, time went on and he just kind of pushed it to the back of his mind. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan was at a big family party in Chico, California. It was a big outdoor barbecue. All of his family was there. At some point, his sister showed up. This was a great surprise. She wasn't supposed to be able to make it, and he hadn't seen her in a while. He immediately pulled her aside so they could catch up. They spent the first hour just chatting about their lives, what they were up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to tell her about his sleep paralysis experience. The reason he wanted to tell her, specifically, was because he knew that she knew he was a total skeptic. If he told her this is what happened, she would believe that's what he genuinely saw, and she wouldn't think he was making it up or exaggerating. So he started by saying, "You know, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis." His sister immediately cut him off. Her eyes went wide. "Wait a minute," she said. "I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room, and then I saw this woman, and she was like standing on me. I thought I was going to die. It was horrible." Nathan just stared at her. "That's exactly what happened to me. I was lying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest." They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. The silent room, the figure in the corner, the feeling of being crushed. At the end of it, they just sat there trying to find a rational explanation for how they both could have had their one and only sleep paralysis experience in the same room around the same time and see the exact same thing. It was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them was really prepared to start discussing what else it could be, some paranormal explanation. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off nervously and say, "Man, that's pretty weird," and they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan went back to his house and told his wife about the crazy coincidence he and his sister had discovered. His wife agreed that it was wild, but after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it anymore. He pushed it out of his mind and moved on with his life. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom moved out of that apartment building and into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come and spend a couple of nights with her, just to help her settle in. And Nathan said, "Sure." In order to understand what happens next, you need a basic layout of her new house. When you walk in through the double front doors, to your left is a formal living room. In the center of the house, a hallway shoots straight back to the kitchen. And to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall are the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs up, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks out into the backyard. Immediately to your right, on that landing, there is a single door. That's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turn to your left, there would be another door, a mirror image of the master bedroom door. This door was the guest room, and that's where Nathan was going to stay. If you went inside that guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, the same layout as the guest room in the old apartment building. For someone lying in the bed, their feet would be closest to the door. From Nathan's perspective, in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new guest room was a table against the right-hand wall, and on that table was a TV. The first night Nathan stayed at the new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, lying on the bed, watching TV. The lights in the room were off, so it was just the glow from the television. At some point, he dozed off. He woke up a short time later, and he couldn't move. It was the same sensation he had felt before back at his mom's apartment. He began to panic. The last time he felt this way, a strange, veiled woman stood on his chest and made him feel like he was dying. So immediately, he was trying to move his body, but he couldn't. Using just his eyes, he started looking around the room, praying that this woman was not in there with him. He looked to the right, to the corner. He could see it clearly. There was no one there. From that corner, he scanned his eyes across the room. He saw the TV. It was still on. He kept scanning, and he saw the door. It was open. And then he scanned further and was just barely able to make out the space at the foot of his bed all the way to the corner. The woman, she wasn't in the room. Initially, he felt this incredible wave of relief. She's not here. But then he found himself focusing on the open door, which led out into the dark hallway. And he was thinking to himself, please, please, do not come walking through that door. So he just stared at the open doorway, hoping he would break out of the sleep paralysis. That's when he noticed something about the TV. It was flickering. He averted his gaze from the door to the TV screen. And he realized that what he was looking at on the TV did not look familiar. It didn't look like a TV show. It looked like CCTV camera footage. Like security camera footage. And then he realized the footage he was looking at was of the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the layout, the cabinets. That was his mother's house. He was staring at the footage thinking, why is this playing on my TV? I don't think there's even a camera down there. And as he's thinking this, he sees on the camera the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. She stops, and she looks up directly at the camera. Right as she does, the TV turns off. The room was now completely dark. There was no more ambient light. The hallway was dark. And he was left there, paralyzed in bed, knowing that this woman was downstairs in the kitchen. As he's lying there in the terrifying silence, he hears her start to run through the house. It sounded like an animal, barreling into things as she ran through the bottom floor. He heard her crash around, and then the sound stopped right at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. As he's lying there, he can feel his heart racing, and he's staring at that open black doorway. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and through that door. But instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one slow step. Then, a second slow step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, one step at a time, he's just thinking, please break out of this. Stop this paralysis. Wake up. Wake up. And then he sees her head emerge above the floor line. She turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around the corner and starts charging into his room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is absolutely scared for his life as this woman charges towards him. She stops dead in her tracks, right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges back downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was gone, Nathan could sit up. Except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's old apartment. Back then, when he sat up, he had a sensation of relief, like you've woken up, you were asleep before, but now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he could just suddenly move. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled. She's half asleep. And she says, Was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her, and he can't even process what he's just been through. He didn't know if it was real or if it was a dream. He was trying to find the words to describe what had just happened, but he couldn't. He just looked at his mom and said, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. So the two of them flipped on every light upstairs. They weren't even talking at this point. It was just survival mode. They turned on all the lights, and Nathan led the way down the stairs. They went through the whole house, flicking on every light, and they managed to search the whole place. There was no sign of a break-in. There was no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to talk about what had just happened. Nathan just laid it all out. He said, Okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. A few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your old apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. I was lying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room, and they were standing on me. It was terrifying. But then, A couple of months after that, I talked to my sister and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that same room and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we both had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house. And you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She said to Nathan, "I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment a long time ago. But I remember what you're describing." That's the experience I had. This woman, she showed up in the room and she stood on me and it scared the heck out of me. But I didn't tell anyone because I just thought it was sleep paralysis. Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same, very specific, terrifying experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed just sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan running around, he was paralyzed in his bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her own bedroom. And she didn't have any pets. So who, or what, could it have been? Nathan says that he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they still don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last terrifying experience Nathan had at her new house. And they're just hoping it stays that way. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a very special event. It was their own baby shower, being held for them by Kathy's family all the way over in Baltimore, Maryland. For them, this was a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio. Because of the long trip, Mark and Kathy really tried to get out the door as early as they possibly could. But, as it often happens, one thing led to another, and they ended up getting a pretty late start. By the time midnight rolled around, they were getting close. They were only about an hour away from their final destination. But at this point, after hours on the road, they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so, they saw a sign for a rest stop and pulled off the highway. It was in a place called Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. As they drove into the rest area parking lot, they noticed it was completely empty. It was late, dark, and quiet. Well, almost empty. There was one other car there. It was a dark blue, late-model 4-door sedan. It was parked head-in, right in front of the public restrooms. Mark and Kathy pulled their car into a spot that was just a few spaces over from this sedan. They got out, stretched their legs for a moment, and then walked up to the restroom building. Mark was done first, so he came back outside and stood by the women's restroom, just waiting for his wife to come out. As he waited, he turned around and faced the blue sedan. When they had first pulled into the lot, Mark had assumed the car was empty. It just seemed that way. But now, as he was looking at it from a different angle, he could clearly see there were 2 people inside. They were sitting in the front 2 seats. In the driver's seat was a middle-aged man. He was sitting behind the steering wheel, and he was looking directly at Mark. Just staring. And next to this guy, in the passenger seat, was a teenager who appeared to be fast asleep. And immediately, Mark felt this really deep, unsettling feeling. He was completely creeped out by these 2. Think about it. You're at a random, isolated rest stop in the middle of the night. It's totally deserted, except for you, your pregnant wife, and these 2 guys in a car. And one of them is just sitting there staring at you with this menacing look. And so, Mark is doing his best not to look intimidated. He's trying to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening. He's just a guy waiting for his wife. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying that Kathy comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible. He just wanted them to get the heck out of there and away from these two creepy guys. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the women's restroom opened and Kathy came out. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed her by the hand, and without giving her any explanation, he rushed them back to their car. They hopped in, he immediately locked the doors, turned the car on, and began backing out of the parking spot. And as he did, he glanced over at the blue sedan one last time. He saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged one, was still looking over at him. He had that same intense, menacing look on his face. As they pulled away, Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-sized hole right above the license plate in the spot where you would normally put the key to open it. The entire scene was just totally bizarre. After Mark and Kathy sped out of the rest stop and were safely back on the highway, Mark finally explained to Kathy what had happened. He told her there were actually two people inside that sedan and that the driver was staring at him and they had just really creeped him out. That's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car so quickly. She agreed that it sounded pretty creepy and they were both glad to be gone. But by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had more or less completely forgotten about their strange experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, it was a happy occasion, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio getting ready for their new baby. About a week later, the couple was at home, just watching TV. Suddenly, a breaking news bulletin came across the screen. It showed a reporter who was standing at a very familiar location. It was the exact same rest stop that they had stopped at on their way to Baltimore, the one in Frederick County, Maryland. And right behind the reporter, cordoned off by police tape, was the very same late-model blue sedan they had seen parked there that night. The headline of this special news bulletin read, "DC Snipers Caught." It would turn out that the middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of that sedan, the one staring at Mark, was none other than John Allen Muhammad. And the person next to him, the teenager who had been sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the two men responsible for a highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that had terrorized the Washington, D.C. area and left 10 people dead. The fist-sized hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through. It was a sniper's port. It allowed them to stay completely concealed inside the trunk of the car while they were shooting their victims from a distance. The police revealed that Muhammad and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to lie low and hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy had pulled in next to them that night, the snipers were only about halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his pregnant wife were not targeted is because the killers were most likely trying to keep that specific rest stop off the police radar. It was their safe spot, their hiding place. And so they wouldn't have risked an attack right there because it would have brought law enforcement to the one place they felt secure. Although, ironically, that rest stop is exactly where they would ultimately be caught. In the end, John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Lee Boyd Malvo is currently serving multiple life sentences. Back in 1988, a 35-year-old man named Ivan McGuire was an experienced skydiving instructor. He had over 700 successful jumps to his name, so he knew exactly what he was doing. On April 5th of that year, he was working in North Carolina, and he was tasked with a very specific job. He was going to be filming other instructors and their students as they jumped out of the plane. The way this worked was pretty straightforward. Ivan would go up in the plane with the instructor and their student. Ivan would then be the first one to leap out of the plane. As he fell, he would roll onto his back and point his camera upward back towards the plane. From this position, he could capture the perfect shot of the student and instructor jumping out. Ivan would then continue to film them as they all fell through the air right up until they pulled their parachutes. At that point, he would stop filming and pull his own. Now, this being 1988, the filming equipment that Ivan was using was much larger and more cumbersome than anything you would use today. He had a voice-activated camera attached to his helmet. From there, a long cord ran down to a big, heavy VHS deck that he kept inside of a backpack. It was an awkward setup, but he was used to it. So, despite the nuisance of the equipment, Ivan went up with the first student and instructor of the day. He jumped, he filmed, and he successfully recorded their jump. Everything went perfectly. When he got back on the ground, Ivan went over to the riggers, who were the people responsible for packing the parachutes. He gave them his rig so they could pack it for him for the next jump. Then, Ivan went over to a bench and began fiddling with his camera equipment. It was clear he was a bit frustrated with the way it was set up, and he was making all sorts of adjustments to the camera and the backpack. When it was time for Ivan's second jump of the day, with a new instructor and a new student, he was so preoccupied with fiddling with his camera that he almost made a huge mistake. He completely forgot to grab his parachute. He ran over to the plane and he was just about to get on when someone yelled out, "Hey, Ivan, you're not wearing a parachute!" He stopped, looked down, and said, "Oh my goodness, you're right!" He ran back over, grabbed his parachute rig, put it on, and then loaded back into the plane. He went up to altitude, he jumped out, he filmed the instructor and student, and it all went great. He made it safely to the ground, and his second jump was a success. And just like after the first jump of the day, Ivan took off his parachute, he gave it to the riggers to be repacked, and then he went and sat down on a bench and continued to fidget and fiddle around with his camera equipment. When it was time for Ivan's third and final jump of the day, with yet another new instructor and student, he seemed to have everything in order this time. He grabbed his parachute, put all of his gear on, ran over to the plane, hopped on board, and he took off. Once they got up to their jumping altitude, which was 10,500 feet, Ivan turned on his camera. The footage begins, and it shows the instructor and the student sitting across from him in the plane, getting their gear together. The jump master, who is towards the front of the plane, slides open the large side door. Ivan, who's going to be the first one out, makes his way to the edge. He turns himself upside down, so he's sitting with his back facing the open sky outside of the plane. He makes sure the instructor and student are right there, ready to jump out right after him. Once they're ready, Ivan lets go and falls out of the plane backwards, and he continues to film. On the tape, you can see the instructor and student jump out right afterwards, just as planned. Ivan continues to film them as they all go down. They're in free fall for a few seconds, and then you see the instructor and the student pull their parachutes. Their canopies open up, and they begin to float gently. At that exact moment, Ivan reaches back to pull his own ripcord. But he can't find it. For a few seconds, you see him start to flail. You can see his hands coming out in front of the camera as he's desperately trying to reach for his ripcord. And then, in that horrible moment, he realizes what's happened. That parachute rig he grabbed before he loaded up on the plane was not a parachute. In his haste and distraction, he had grabbed his heavy backpack, the one that had that big VHS deck in it. When he put it on, he had mistaken its weight and feel for his parachute. And so now, he's falling at terminal velocity over 120 miles per hour with absolutely no way to stop himself. He begins yelling. You can hear him scream, "Oh no! Oh God, no!" He keeps reaching back as if he's just going to magically find the cord, but there's nothing there. After a few agonizing seconds, you can see the ground getting closer and closer and closer. And then, the footage cuts out. Ivan's body was later found about 1.5 miles outside of the designated drop zone, deep in the woods. His camera and the videotape were severely damaged from the impact, but investigators were able to splice the tape back together. And that's the only reason we know what happened in his final, tragic moments. An investigation into his death showed that the pilot had made the same mistake Ivan did. When the pilot saw Ivan get on the plane with that backpack on, he simply assumed it was a parachute. And so, ultimately, Ivan's death was ruled a terrible accident. As a fair warning, if you look into this case, you will almost certainly come across the actual footage of Ivan's final jump. In 1980, a young man named Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is about 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the general area, he didn't know a single person that was going to this particular school. And so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he hadn't been that popular in high school, and he always had a bit of a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars, carrying boxes and luggage up to their dorm rooms. He took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. It was a strange feeling. A couple of people even yelled out to him and said things like, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." One girl actually ran up to him, gave him a big kiss on the cheek, and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." Bobby was completely confused and said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." She just laughed and ran away. And so Bobby is totally bewildered by this. He doesn't know anybody here, but for some reason, everybody seems to know him. He walks up the steps, and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. Then, right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" By this point, Bobby knew whoever it was had to be yelling at him. This whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling, "Hey, Eddie, come here!" "What's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not. But I'm not Eddie." "Who's Eddie?" And the guy just said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie. It's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's just standing there thinking, what is going on here? So Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room. He goes inside and shuts the door. He's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second, because this is just not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. In just a couple of minutes, after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door. And Bobby's like, "Oh, great. Who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not?" So he opens the door, and there's another student who he doesn't know standing there. And this guy, his face just drains of all color. He starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both just looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, "Were you adopted?" And Bobby said, "Yeah." And then the student asked, "Is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, "Yeah." And so the student goes, "Okay, my name is Michael, and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin." At this point, to Bobby, this almost made a bizarre kind of sense. But it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin out there that he never knew about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie, because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone he had talked to was so excited to see him. They all loved Eddie, and they thought Bobby was him, and they were psyched to have him back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie. They have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie, and vice versa. And so, Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there together, and they dial up Eddie's number. As soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, "Hey, Eddie, my name's Bobby, and everybody here thinks I'm you." And then Eddie says, "Yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too." Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, it sounded just like his own voice coming through the phone. And so, ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that he and Bobby could see if it really was true, if they really were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped into Bobby's car, and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. When they got there, it was the middle of the night. Eddie's house was the only house in this quiet suburb that had all the lights on. Michael and Bobby walked up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby was about to knock on the door, it flew open. And standing in front of Bobby was his exact clone. It was Eddie. And Eddie was looking back at Bobby, and he couldn't believe what he was looking at. They were definitely identical twins. They both immediately saw it. Michael would say that after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time they had this instant connection. They immediately knew they were related. They were laughing and they hugged and they just stared at each other. Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after this, the story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York. They decided they would look into it to see if it was really true. One of the editors had a junior reporter go out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and confirm if they were, in fact, identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody who read it loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kellman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins, because these two twins looked exactly like David. Specifically, they said, you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie. And sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then, when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his. And they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number. Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kellman. I was born the 12th of July, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me. And one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin." After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork!" So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house. And as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away. He was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were all wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen. That it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story, talking about how there were actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected. And once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story. And now, this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper. They were on every talk show. And everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school. We all smoked the same brand of cigarettes. We like the same food. We have the same taste in women. And on these talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the exact same mannerisms. On the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight. And all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together, they went out partying, they even met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't really asking too many questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions. Because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings, they had no idea. So the boys' adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was called Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York used this adoption agency if they were going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids had been separated. The parents went to New York, they went into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they said, "Did you separate our sons at birth on purpose?" And one of the executives said, "Yes, we did." Because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said that was absolute BS. He said if they had told him his son had 2 identical siblings, he would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened. And so, sorry, that's all we can tell you. The parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story. In fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. But right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't disturb anyone, and he opened the door to the meeting room. He reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside. And he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne. They were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the distinct sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they had clearly just lied to the families of these 3 triplets, and they'd gotten away with it. So, between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby's father discovering this champagne toast, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so, initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. The parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this. That clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so, unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn. Over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much, because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. Over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. At some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. In the first year, it was extremely successful. It did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together, they had never really fought before, and so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business, and it got really bad really quick. They just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so, at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the 3 brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together, and now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks. And then, shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the 2 surviving brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article. It was called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied. Although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research, In this article, Lawrence discovered that all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency. The same one the triplets had come from, Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health and if that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered. And after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered each other. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Bobby did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, this was part of a study. But they didn't get any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging, and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was a doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was a very well-known psychologist in New York. Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, "I won't answer any of your questions, and I won't give you any information about this study." And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives, so no one could access it until the year 2066. This has led many people to believe that the reason he set the date so far out was to guarantee that all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved. In the recent documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowicz, was interviewed. They asked her if she could shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were. She said that she was not actually part of the study, she was just on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. She said the point of the study was to finally put to bed the age-old question of whether it was nature or nurture that made a person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that makes you who you are, or is it just your genetic makeup? Are you predestined to become a particular person, independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible. That basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup. That we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household, where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family, with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they owned a small shop. Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up, he had a different story. He visited under the false pretext that they were there as part of a routine follow-up for the adoption agency. He went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class. It was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child from the same agency. That first child effectively became the guinea pig, where scientists would come in and study the child, creating a baseline of how these parents parent. And then, once that baseline was established, the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up. The adoptive father was the key variable. Bobby's father, the doctor, was rarely around, but was devoted and loving. David's father, the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son unconditionally. But Eddie's father, the teacher, was very strict and rough with Eddie. He was quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was. That David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing, and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study, that we're all genetically predisposed. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third-hand information. But what we do know for sure is that these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was ever done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. When they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results. But it turned out to be over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place or what it accomplished. It was all just very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved, none of them were ever held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study. And so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Over the years, a lot of people have claimed they were abducted by aliens. And if we're being realistic, there's no real, tangible proof that any human has ever stepped foot on an extraterrestrial spacecraft or visited another dimension. What we have are these wild stories from people who claim it happened to them. And while a lot of these stories are very quickly dismissed as hoaxes, there's one abduction story that is almost universally seen as the most famous and maybe the most believable of all time. And that is the story of Travis Walton. What makes this case so different, so famous, is that unlike almost every other alien abduction story, which usually just boils down to one person's first-hand account, this one was different. This one had a full-scale police investigation. It had up to 16 separate lie detector tests that were given to Travis Walton himself, along with all the other witnesses who were there that day. And most importantly, it had a group of 6 other perfectly level-headed men who said they actually saw the abduction happen. These guys have stuck to their story, every single one of them, for over 40 years. They all passed their lie detector tests, and not one of them has ever changed their story. And you have to think, at some point, you might be tempted to change your story, because these men came under an incredible amount of scrutiny. This single event basically derailed most of their lives and their careers because everyone started labeling them as crazy people. They became famous, sure, but in all the worst ways. So you have all these different elements that make this story seem, well, strangely credible. Even if you don't believe it was an alien abduction, you still have to figure out how to explain it. How do you explain the past lie detector tests where they're talking about a UFO? How do you account for the fact that Travis Walton was genuinely missing for 5 full days with absolutely no idea where he was? And there was a massive search effort looking for him in the exact area where he would have been. There are just so many unanswered questions. But the story itself, the story of what the other men saw happen, and then Travis's own story about what happened to him after he was taken, it all makes for an absolutely incredible tale. It's been turned into books and movies, and even to this day, it remains one of, if not the, single most fascinating purported alien abduction stories ever told. By the year 1975, Travis Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, had built up a bit of a bad boy reputation in his small hometown of Snowflake, Arizona. He was the kind of guy who rode a loud Harley-Davidson motorcycle right through the middle of town. He was a wild bull rider, and he was a boxer. There was this one story that people told about Travis. He was out driving with his friends one day, and they were just going down this road when a huge bear suddenly jumped out of the woods. It landed right in the middle of the road and just stood there. And Travis, without even thinking about it, just leaps out of the moving car and starts chasing after this massive bear. He actually scared it back into the woods and then kept chasing it for a good ways. So, that was Travis. He was known as this kind of rebel, maybe a little bit of a problem child, but he was absolutely beloved by his friends. He was just one of those cool guys who did things his own way. Travis and the 6 other men he worked with were loggers. They would get contracts to go out and clear trees in a specific area. Now, these weren't a big-time operation with huge, heavy machinery. We're talking about chainsaws, regular saws, and axes. They were just these blue-collar, hard-working guys, and they would go out into the forest and clear patches of trees. That's what they did for a living. And it was a dangerous job. You're cutting down these enormous trees, and you're usually working pretty fast. You're operating dangerous equipment like chainsaws. Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss and was there on the day all this happened, he said in a number of interviews that the men he hired for these jobs had to be incredibly level-headed. They were not the kind of people you'd expect to come up with some fantastical story about an alien encounter. On the 5th of November, 1975, Mike Rogers and his crew got a new contract. They were supposed to clear out a huge 1,200-acre plot of land inside of the Sitgreaves National Forest. So Mike got his crew together. They all piled into the one pickup truck that Mike owned, and they headed out. Mike knew from the start that this was going to be a really, really difficult job. It was a massive area to cover, and he told his men right up front, "We're going to be working incredibly hard, so you need to expect long, full days." And so for the first 3 days of the job, even though they were working these extremely long hours and barely taking any breaks, they were still falling behind schedule. At the end of this 3rd day, it was late. They had worked all day long, and every single one of them was just completely and totally exhausted. Finally, they decided to wrap it up for the night. They all piled back into Mike's truck, all 7 of them, and they started the long drive down the access road back towards the main road that would take them back to town. As they were driving, they weren't really talking about work anymore. They were mostly just joking around, talking about what they were going to do that night. And as they're driving down this road, and remember, it's heavily forested on both sides, they looked off to their right, and they saw some lights in the forest. They all said in interviews later that they all noticed it, but at first, it didn't really stand out as anything strange or bad. It could have been anything, and they weren't really thinking about it. But as they kept driving down this road, the light seemed to get brighter, or maybe it was just that they couldn't help but notice it anymore. They all started commenting on this light. They're all looking at it, and somebody in the truck suggested that, "Oh, it's probably just the moon. It's a full moon tonight." But then one of the other guys on the other side of the truck happened to look out his window away from where the light was. And he goes, "No, the moon's over here. It's on this side of the road." So they knew it wasn't the moon. Then someone else suggested, maybe it's a forest fire. Maybe we should go check it out. But then Mike Rogers, who was driving, the crew boss, he's like, "No, if it was a fire, there'd be smoke." There's no smoke or anything. And then there was Travis. Remember, this is the guy who jumps out of cars to chase down bears. He was a total adrenaline junkie. And he's like, "Hey, let's just drive over there and see what it is. I don't know, it could be anything. Let's go check it out." The other guys in the truck were a little on edge about the idea, but ultimately they figured, what's the harm? They knew there was another little road that led over to that section of the forest. They'd just drive over, get a quick look at whatever this thing was, and then they'd leave. So they turn and they drive down this other little access road. They come around a bend, and they pull into a clearing where the lights were coming from. And they are absolutely astounded by what they see. Every single one of them was later polygraphed separately about what they saw when they reached this clearing. And each one of them described the exact same thing with just slightly different details based on their own perspective. And all of the polygraph tests showed that they were all telling the truth. What they saw was this disc-shaped craft. It had what looked like panels of lights on its underside, and it was just hovering there in the clearing, maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground. It wasn't spinning or moving at all. It was just floating in midair, as if it was suspended by nothing. And the men, in their interviews later on, they would all say that what struck them was not just the fact that there was this craft there, but how bizarre it was to see this thing just defying gravity. It wasn't moving at all, but it was just hanging there in the air right in front of them. One of the men, a guy who actually built houses and was a very handy guy, he even started commenting at length about the structural framework of this craft. He could see that there was some really impressive engineering on the underside of it. He said it was just a beautiful, beautiful machine. And they're all just sitting there in the truck staring at it. And Travis, he is so excited when they get to this clearing. He has no idea what he's looking at, but just like with the bear, where he jumped out and chased it, as soon as the truck was almost at a complete stop in this clearing, right next to this ship, he's jumping out of the car. Nobody else gets out, just Travis. And he starts walking just a little ways away from the truck, straight towards this craft. The craft doesn't move. It's just hovering there. From where they had parked, it was maybe 50 or 100 feet away from them, and then another 50 or 100 feet up in the air. And the crew, they don't say anything at first. They're just completely dumbfounded by what they're looking at. Travis is also dumbfounded, but he's walking towards it. He would say later in an interview that he was frightened, but he was mostly just curious. He knew he was looking at something that no one had ever seen before, some sort of craft that he couldn't identify, but it was absolutely fascinating to him. And so he kept walking closer and closer and closer to it. And as the crew in the truck kind of came out of their initial shock of seeing this unidentified flying object, they start yelling for Travis to come back. They all had this bad feeling, this sense that something was about to happen. And they thought, you shouldn't go near that thing. Come back. Not to mention, it's just hovering there in the air. What if it just falls and lands on you? They're yelling, Travis, get back over here. And it was like once one person started yelling for Travis to come back, they all did. And Travis remembered hearing them screaming for him to get back to the truck, but he wasn't really paying any attention. He just kept walking. And finally, he stops. He's just standing there, looking up at it. And Travis would say he was just struck by the beauty of the underside of this craft with all these different panels of lights built into it. It was this incredible piece of machinery. He's just looking at it, and then all of a sudden, it starts to spin just a little bit. And it starts to emit this noise, this loud mechanical sound that all of them reported hearing. And now, the yells from the crew are getting louder and louder. And Travis would say that he knew he needed to turn around and go back, but he just wanted to look for a few more seconds. He was just about to turn and head back to the truck when all of a sudden a beam of light comes out of the craft and strikes Travis, just like a lightning strike. And all of the crew saw this happen. He gets blown back about 20 feet. He was literally lifted off the ground and thrown 20 feet through the air. And they watched it all happen. Again, in all of their polygraph tests, they all said the exact same thing, and they all passed. He was hit by a ray of light from this UFO, and it knocked him back 20 feet. Mike Rogers, in a complete panic, along with everybody else in the crew, they just decided to leave. And as Mike is driving away like a maniac, leaving Travis behind, they're all trying to convince themselves that he's already dead. They're saying, we just watched him get shot by something. We don't know what that is. They're completely freaked out. They don't even know what they just saw. They're crying. They're hysterical. These are grown men, just absolutely terrified. And they're driving for a little ways until finally Mike just slams on the brakes and he stops the truck. And Mike is like, we have to go back for him. He said, you guys can stay here and wait for me if you want, but this truck is going back to get Travis. And so the idea of waiting out there in the open after seeing what they just saw was even worse than the idea of going back. They wanted to stay together. So, a little bit begrudgingly, but knowing that they had to do it, they all got back in the truck. Mike turned it around and they started driving back up to the site where the UFO was. As they make it back up to the clearing, they notice that there are no lights up there anymore. The craft is gone. And there's no Travis. They get out of the truck, and now Mike is just uncontrollably crying because he feels like they just abandoned his friend, and now where did he go? Everybody else is in total shock. They can't believe it. They started screaming for Travis. They're running around in the woods, yelling his name, looking for any sign of him. They really don't know what happened, but they know Travis is not there. And after a little bit of time of looking, they're like, we have to tell the police. And they knew it was going to be bad for them. They knew that when they told the police the story, a UFO came and zapped Travis and now he's gone, they knew that wasn't going to sit well with the police. But they also knew that they had to do it because they wanted to find Travis and they were very, very concerned about their friend. Mike and a few of the other crew members were just unable to even think straight. They were crying, they were so upset. And so finally, they drive until they get to a payphone. The first payphone they saw, this was 1975. And a man named Ken Peterson, who was this very kind of simple, matter-of-fact guy, recently married, just a very simple, level-headed person, he decides that he's going to be the one to call the police because he was the only one who was composed enough to do it. He calls the sheriff's department and he says, you've got to come out here. We can't find our friend, Travis Walton. We'll have to describe it to you when you get here because trying to do it over the phone is not going to do it justice. But he's gone, and we don't know where he went. Shortly after that, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and his partner Ken Coplin, they show up at this rest stop where the payphone was. They get to the scene, they see Ken Peterson, who made the call to them, and they're like, all right, tell us what's going on. The rest of the crew has now gotten out of the truck. They definitely look distraught. And Ken begins to try to describe what happened, but he hasn't said the word UFO. He hasn't said aliens. He just said, we were up at the logging site. We had a contract up there. And then, it's just hard to describe. And Mike Rogers jumps in. He's like, we saw a UFO, an array of light hit Travis, and then he disappeared. And the sheriffs are just looking at them like, really? And so they stopped him right there and said, all right, I need to search your truck to make sure you guys aren't under the influence of something. And the crew's like, we haven't done anything. We've been working all day. They search the truck, find nothing. They check each of the men to see if they're sober, and all of their field tests show that they were all completely sober. And Sheriff Gillespie, who was the main sheriff in charge, even though he was a total skeptic and so was Sheriff Coplin, he would later say that during that first engagement with the 6 crew members, they were obviously shaken up by something. Something had happened to them. They didn't know what it was, but these men were genuinely shaken up. What Sheriff Gillespie actually believed was that they were creating a hoax to cover up a real crime. He believed that they had harmed Travis Walton in some way, and they were using this UFO story to cover it up. But he was also thinking to himself, this is a really bad hoax. It's not very well planned. They don't really have their stories lined up particularly well. They're not doing a very good job of explaining it. The only thing they're doing well is acting scared. A couple of hours later, the sun is starting to come up. This had all happened super late at night. And Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Coplin have organized this huge search effort up in the forest where Travis had gone missing. The crew members, they're all still there as well. A bunch of volunteers showed up. They are scouring the entire area. I mean, they've got dogs out, they've got these huge teams of people looking everywhere, and they can't come up with anything. I mean, they are looking everywhere, and there is no sign. There's nothing. There is nothing from Travis. And so, while all this is going on, Sheriff Coplin and Sheriff Gillespie have started coming over to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew and basically saying things like, hey, if you just tell us where Travis Walton's body is, we'll go easy on you guys. We know you did it, and the crew can feel that the pressure is really mounting. They know that if they don't find Travis, even though they didn't do anything, according to their story, they're going to face serious repercussions. Because that's just the way the world works. You don't get to say aliens did this and not have any blame placed on you because there's no proof. They just have their own eyewitness testimony, and that's it. And so the crew has started to become very worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about Travis, of course, but they're also starting to see that they're probably going to be prosecuted for this unless they find Travis. And so they're all very stressed out. And they notice during the search, on this first day of searching, that there are these three guys wearing red jackets. And these guys had these tools that were scanning the ground, almost like a metal detector. And Mike Rogers, he was hoping that during this investigation, they would have people come out who were like paranormal investigators. I guess maybe he was a little naive to think that the police would actually do that, but he thought, given the fact that we've all said this was a UFO that zapped Travis, who then disappeared, that they would have at least one person representing the kind of paranormal side of the investigation coming out. And so he sees these guys in red with their special tools that look like metal detectors, and his gut tells him they're paranormal investigators. So Mike goes over to them and he's like, "Hey, what are these tools you guys are using? What is this?" And they look at him and they're like, "Oh, well, this tests for radiation. We're scanning for radiation in the area." And he asked them, "What group are you guys with? Are you with the sheriff's department?" And they just didn't really answer him. They just said, "Oh, we're just checking for radiation in the area. That's just what we do." And Mike sees an opportunity here. Because when that ship emitted that ray of light that ultimately blew Travis Walton 20 feet and then made him disappear, they were within range of that big ball of lightning. And they were very much in the kind of cone where if there had been radiation coming off of that ship, he believed that perhaps they would have been hit with it. And so he asked the guys with the red jackets and their little radiation tools to scan the crew's jackets and their bodies to see if they were radioactive. And so the crew comes over and they scan them, and there's nothing. No trace elements of radioactivity. They're like, "No, there's nothing here." And then Mike realizes that from the time they called the sheriff until the search started, all of the crew had gone home and changed clothes before they came back out to do the search. And so he thought, well then, any of the radioactive materials would have been on our clothes, which aren't here. But we have our hard hats in the back of the truck that were out here the whole time. They were potentially exposed to whatever was out there from the ship. Can you test those? And so he brought over one of their helmets. And the guy in red scans the helmet, and the ticker goes all the way over, fully radioactive. And the guy in red, he looked up at Mike and then looked down at the helmet he was scanning. And he's looking at him, kind of trying to size him up. And then he turns and he kind of gestures at the other two men in red and tells them to stop what they're doing. And they come over and they're scanning the helmets as well. And then, without any indication of what the results were or what this meant, because Mike is kind of waiting for them to tell him what's going to happen, the guys in red just turn around and say, "Okay." And they just start walking away. And Mike's like, "Well, wait, what does this mean?" And they don't turn around. They just walk away from the search site. And so the other crew members are watching this happen too. And Mike and the crew are like trying to get them to come back, but they're not turning around. They're just leaving. And then they're gone. And so Mike goes over to the sheriffs. And they know the sheriffs think they did something to Travis. These are not their friends. But they figured they needed to ask them who those guys in red were. So they go over to Sheriff Gillespie and they're like, "Hey, who were those guys in the red jackets with the radiation detectors?" And Sheriff Gillespie is like, "Who?" "There's no one here looking for radiation. Everyone who is here because I ordered them to be here." "Who are they? Where are they?" And he's like, "They just walked over there." They went around the corner there, and Sheriff Gillespie was like, "Well, I didn't order them to be here." And it would turn out that they couldn't locate these three people. No one knew who they were. Mike went around and asked anybody who seemed like an authority figure if they knew who these people were. They asked people that interacted with them, and no one knew. After the search, which goes on for a couple of days, turns up absolutely nothing. There's no sign of Travis. The town of Snowflake, Arizona really turned on the 6 crew members. Everybody believed that they had done something to Travis. They believed that this UFO thing was a hoax and that they had harmed Travis and were using this as a cover-up. And the sheriff's department, they really perpetuated that idea. They were pretty open about the fact that they did not believe this was a UFO situation. This was not an alien abduction. This was a missing person case, and frankly, they believed the UFO thing was a complete hoax. National and international media had picked this story up, and it became this massively viral story all over the world. News media outlets were converging on Snowflake, Arizona, and they were inundating the sheriff's department with requests for more information about the supposed alien abduction. And it was really frustrating the two sheriffs who were leading the investigation, Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland. They were already skeptical and really upset about feeling like they were being taken advantage of by these crew members with this hoax as they believed it was. And so Sheriff Gillespie and Copeland decided, you know what? We're going to just cut through all the BS here. We're going to make these boys take a lie detector test. So they go out and they get one of the country's best polygraph examiners to come in and administer a lie detector test on each of the 6 crew members. And so one by one, over the course of the day, each crew member was tested for 2 hours. They were asked the same questions, all centering on the criminal side of things, the foul play angle for Travis Walton. They all go through it. And it turned out that 5 of the 6 had all shown that they were telling the truth. And the 6th person, his test was just inconclusive. It didn't mean that he was lying, it just meant that the test wasn't done very well. And this polygraph examiner, he had anywhere from a 92 to a 98% accuracy rate. He was one of the best in the entire country. And he even would say, it would be so difficult to fake that, to have 5 people, let's say this is all a big hoax, and they harmed Travis Walton, it would be almost impossible to have 5 people be able to pass my examination and have nobody slip up. They were telling the truth. And so the examiner tells the sheriff this. And Sheriff Gillespie is just dumbfounded because he truly believed that they were going to find out they were all lying and that this could just become a pure criminal investigation and it would be, let's go find Travis Walton's body. But now, the examiner is telling him they're telling the truth. And so Sheriff Gillespie and his partner are like, now what do we do? And then 5 days after Travis's disappearance, Travis shows back up. During numerous interviews, Travis would say that he remembers waking up on a road. He didn't recognize where he was, but it was nighttime, it was raining, and he sensed a very bright light above him. And so as he's lying there, he turns his head to look up into the sky, and he sees what looks like the underside of that ship. Because he remembered how struck he was by the beauty of the engineering underneath that disc UFO they saw in the forest. It looked the same. His vision was not great, but he's looking up, and he's pretty confident that's what he's looking at. And then it just flies up into the sky, and it's gone. And he's left in total darkness on a road in some place he doesn't know. He remembers standing up and feeling very weak and depleted and dehydrated, and he just knew that he had to get to civilization. He had to just go in a direction and find someone who could help him because he was so weak. He knew he would die out there if he didn't find someone who could help. And so he musters up the strength to stand up and he starts kind of staggering down the road. And eventually, through just pure adrenaline, he just starts running. And luckily, he sees up ahead that there's a rest stop. And at rest stops, there are payphones. He makes his way down and he goes to the payphone. And he still has change in his pocket. He puts it in the payphone, and he ends up calling his brother. And his brother, he can't believe he's talking to Travis, because at this point, everyone assumed Travis was probably dead. He didn't believe it was actually Travis. But Travis just said to him over and over again, "It's me. They brought me back." And he tells him where he is, because now he recognizes that this rest stop is actually in Snowflake, Arizona. When his brother picks him up, Travis would say that he believed that this was just minutes after the initial abduction. He didn't even know he had been abducted. It's like he's just coming to, and he's like, man, what happened? I was just over at that clearing where I saw this ship, and now I'm over here. What am I doing here? And so Travis's brother is looking at him like, Where have you been? We've been so worried about you for the past several days." And Travis was kind of almost catatonic. He's in shock. He doesn't know what's going on. He looks at his brother and he's like, "What do you mean days?" And his brother's like, "You've been missing for 5 days." And so Travis would say that when he heard this news, this revelation that he had been missing for 5 days, it absolutely put him into shock. He was in a catatonic state where he couldn't make sense of it. And so he just sat there quietly, and his brother is looking at him, not really sure what to even ask. He asked him a couple of times what happened, and Travis just didn't answer because he didn't know. He couldn't explain it. And so Travis's brother decides, instead of just immediately calling the police, "I want to bring you to a hospital because clearly that needs to happen." And frankly, with the media circus that's going on, as soon as they find out you're back, it's just going to be mayhem. I want to make sure you're taken care of first. So he drives to Phoenix, Arizona, and he brings him to a hospital. And he asks the doctors to be discreet. And he has a doctor do an examination. The doctor knew who Travis Walton was because he had been following the news. And he's doing an examination of Travis, and, he was malnourished, and he was tired, and he looked very sick. But there were no physical wounds, with the exception of one puncture site in his arm, in the crook of his arm. Travis was not a drug user, so it wasn't like that was a mark from using drugs. It was a puncture site. And they assumed someone had recently put a needle in his arm. And also, the doctor drug tested him and tested his blood, and there were no drugs in his system. It wasn't like he'd been using any sort of substance. So he kind of had a clear bill of health, minus the injection site and looking pretty ragged. And so after the examination, Travis's brother brings Travis back to his home in Phoenix. As soon as they get back, his home phone is getting constant phone calls. Word had made its way to the sheriff's department back in Snowflake, and they're nonstop calling Travis's brother like, "Hey, we hear he's back. We have to talk to him. We have to talk to him." Sheriff Gillespie, he drives all the way to Phoenix. He goes in, and he sits down to talk to Travis. And Sheriff Gillespie would say that Travis looked like he was in shock. He looked like he had been through something traumatic. It did not seem like he was acting. And he starts asking Travis what happened. And Travis, he does mention the UFO. He mentioned seeing this thing in a clearing, that he gets struck by some light, he doesn't know what it was, and then, he's on the road 5 days later, and he can't really make sense of what happened. He just didn't really know what happened over those 5 days. And finally, Sheriff Gillespie just kinda had to give up. He's like, "Well, we have no way to arrest him. We have no proof of anything," and so he decided, "We're going to be in touch," and he drives back. And then the media starts showing up. Huge news trucks start showing up outside. Everybody had found out where he was because this was such a huge story, and everybody wanted answers. Finally, the National Enquirer, they reached out and they said, "Hey, if you give us an exclusive story, if Travis speaks to us about what happened to him, we will get you out of here. We'll bring you to a private location, and we'll even pay to have Travis undergo a whole other battery of tests that are not typically done to see if they could figure out what had happened to him." And so they agreed to go with the National Enquirer. So by the time he's actually sitting there talking to the people from the National Enquirer, he's had a little bit of time to maybe let his memory kind of kick back in about what had happened. And he's having these flashes of memory of what happened over those 5 days. Because initially, all he could remember was seeing the craft and then being on the road 5 days later. And so when he's sitting down with the National Enquirer people, he begins to recall what actually happened over those 5 days. And so this is what he said happened. He said that he remembers getting out of the truck and walking towards this craft, and he remembers his crew members yelling at him to come back. He knew they were yelling at him to come back. He just wanted to look at the craft a little bit longer. And then, right as he was about to turn around and head back, the craft started moving. This loud, kind of mechanical, eerie sound is being made, and before he had a chance to run back, he gets hit with this lightning bolt of some kind. Then, he remembers being in the presence of some doctors. He saw white lab coats, masks, and facial coverings. And he's kind of in and out of consciousness. And he's seeing this orange light around him, but he definitely sees what looks like medical professionals. And he's thinking to himself, whatever happened with that ship, it must have hurt me. And my crew must have scooped me up and brought me to the hospital. And so in his kind of in and out state, he's aware that he's around medical professionals, or at least what he believes are medical professionals. And at some point, his vision clears. It goes from foggy and in and out to being pretty much lucid. And he looks down at his chest, and there's a rectangular box sitting on his chest that he didn't recognize. It didn't really look like modern medical equipment. It just looked like this, almost like a rock, sitting on his chest. And he looks at that, and then he looks up at one of the people who's wearing a mask, who's working on him, one of the medical professionals, and this person is working on this box. And then the person looks at Travis Walton, and then leans in to look even closer at Travis Walton. And Travis is horrified. It was this grayish, thin, narrow-headed figure that was very short, maybe like 4 feet high, who was looking in at him. And its eyes were like slits. And it's just looking at Travis. And Travis, who's unbelievably scared at this point, he pushes everything off of him and rips out all the cords that are attached to him. He kind of topples off of this table that he was on. And he realizes he's in a fairly small room, and there are 3 of these humanoid creatures in the room with him. And he picks up the biggest instrument he can see next to the table that he was just lying on. He didn't know what it was. And he starts wildly waving it at them and screaming at them, "Get away from me!" And he's trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And the 3 figures in the lab coats, they start walking closer and closer to him. And they're just kind of looking up at him, trying to study him a little bit. They get all the way up to him, and he's waving this thing, and he's almost about to hit one of them when they just kind of abruptly turn around and leave the room, leaving him all alone in this kind of examination room. And as soon as they leave, he watches them go down a little hallway outside the door, and they turn left. And so he's practically paralyzed with fear, but he knows if he can't get out of this room, he's done for. And so finally, he kind of gets himself together, and he walks past the examination table. He goes down the hallway outside of the door, and instead of going left where they went, he kind of sneaks off to the right and starts walking. And he comes to another room. And it's a room that has a single chair in it. It's this tiny little room with a chair, and the chair is turned away from him. He begins to peer around the chair, and he sees that no one is sitting there. So he goes around in front of the chair, and he's like touching the wall, looking for a doorknob or any sort of mechanism that can get him out of this room. And he said the room, it was like this perfectly flat, everything was flat and smooth. There were no door handles. He couldn't find a way out. And he ultimately sees on the chair that it looks like there are some buttons on the chair itself. He pushes all these buttons on the chair, and nothing happens. And then, in the doorway where he came in, suddenly a person, a man, appears in the doorway who's wearing what looks like a spacesuit, like an astronaut suit. And Travis is so immediately relieved. Even though the weirdness of him being in an astronaut suit is pretty high, he's like, it's a human. And he doesn't know what to think about the fact that he's now excited to see a human, right? Like, it's terrifying that you were just around these non-humans, but he's in panic mode now. He sees another human being, and he runs over to him, and he says, "Please, you've got to help me. I don't know where I am. Where are we? What is this? What's going on?" And he notices that the eyes of this person inside of the spacesuit, it's a man, or at least it looks like a man, but his eyes are distant. He's not making eye contact with Travis. It's like he's in a trance. And he said his eyes just seemed off, like they just weren't focused on him. It would be like if you're talking to someone, but they were permanently looking away from you. There was just something off about him, and he never spoke. And so he's trying to ask this guy, "Where are we?" And the guy takes him by the arm, and he just starts leading him back into the hall where he came from, and they continue down the hall, not back towards the room where he was originally, but down the hall in the other direction, and they get to another door, and he opens it up. And Travis the whole time is like pleading with this guy to help him, and he thinks that this guy is helping him. He thinks that this is his savior. and he feels relieved that a human being, albeit a strange human being, is helping him. And eventually, he stops asking him any questions because the guy in the spacesuit is just not reacting to him at all. They open this door, and they go down into this huge hangar where there are all these spacecraft that look just like the one that he saw in the clearing. And they start walking down between all these spacecraft that are just hovering, much like they were hovering in the forest, seemingly able to just defy gravity. And the whole time, this guy in the spacesuit is saying nothing. And Travis is like, what is this? What are these craft? Is this military? The guy says nothing. They walk to the far side of the hangar, and they open up another door. And they go into another bright white room. And there are 3 more human-like people with the strange eye thing going on in spacesuits that are standing there next to another medical table. And they're looking not at Travis, but their bodies are aimed in the direction of the door that they came in through. Travis goes in, and he sees these 3, and he thinks, these people are here to save me. Like, again, I feel relieved to see humans, albeit strange humans, but nonetheless, humans. And the guy who had brought him in there continues to lead him over to the 3 other people. And they pick him up, and they put him on the table. He starts kind of resisting because he doesn't know what they're doing. They're not speaking. He said, what are you doing? And they forced him onto this table, and he's feeling pretty weak at this point. And they take a gas mask, and they put it over his face. And then he blacks out. And his next memory after that is when he woke up on the road and had the light above him that flew away, and he had to go to the payphone to call his brother. Travis did not immediately go and speak to the crew members that were there that night. It took quite a bit of time. You know, he was talking to the press, he was doing interviews, the police wanted to talk to him. There was a lot going on. But he eventually got together with the other 6 crew members. And they all met up at Mike Rogers, the crew boss's house. And they just said, you've got to tell us what happened. And so he sits down and he tells the story. All of them believed him. They didn't want to believe him, but they believed him because they saw the first half of this story. They saw it for themselves. And once he was done telling it, they didn't really have that many questions. They just felt bad. They felt like if they had just stayed there and taken Travis, he wouldn't have been taken. But they didn't know that. And so all of them would leave Mike's house that day, and they would all go their separate ways. They did not stay in touch. They went their separate ways. It was like this hugely traumatic event that even to this day, you have 40 plus years later, when they talk about it, they're often brought to tears. Ken Peterson's interviews are particularly striking because when he talks about it, he's an older man now, and he says, to this day, I'm scared to look out my window because I'm afraid I'm going to see a spaceship. And he starts crying when he talks about it. I mean, this had a profound impact on these 7 men. And some of them didn't do so well. This whole story, it ruined their credibility. Even though this is the most believable alien abduction story, the truth is, most people think it's a hoax. You know, one of them, his own family, basically disowned him because they felt so embarrassed about this whole story. They didn't believe him. So, if this was a hoax, to what end? What did they get out of it? Nothing. It damaged their lives. Following this case, over the span of 40 years, there would be 16 lie detector tests taken. 5 by Travis Walton and 11 by the remaining crew. And they would all pass. The one member of that initial polygraph set, when 5 had passed and 1 was inconclusive, he was retested with the same exact test, and he did pass. It's just one of those things where we're left with this incredible story where modern technology says they're telling the truth, but we can't fit that truth into what we think of as normal life. And so we've just decided that there's going to be a group of people that believe, and there's going to be a group of people that don't. And you're left to pick which side you're on. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On a cold evening in December of 2005, a young woman was making her way down a sidewalk in New York City. The city was alive with the holiday spirit. Christmas lights were strung up on all the buildings, and decorations filled the shop windows. It was a festive scene. But as the woman walked, her eyes drifted over to a nearby newspaper stand. And something she saw on the front page of the paper made her stop dead in her tracks. It wasn't festive at all. It was the opposite. Staring back at her from the front page was a picture of a person she had hoped she would never have to see again for the rest of her life. On the evening of Sunday, the 27th of November, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods was in the bathroom of her small New York City apartment, carefully leaning towards the mirror. She was putting on her eyeliner, getting ready for work. Her phone, sitting on the counter beside her, buzzed with an incoming call. But Catherine didn't even glance at it. She was in a hurry and didn't have a moment to spare. Her shift started at 7 o'clock, and she couldn't be late. Catherine had moved to the big city from her home in Ohio 3 years earlier. She had a dream, a big one. She wanted to be a dancer on Broadway. But New York City is an expensive place to live, especially when you're chasing a dream. So, to make ends meet, Catherine was working 3 different jobs. 2 of her jobs were pretty normal. She was a waitress at a local restaurant, and she also taught dance classes to children, which she really enjoyed. But tonight, she was getting ready for her 3rd job. And this job was different. It wasn't something she was proud of. In fact, she felt a sense of shame about it, so much so that she kept it a secret from almost everyone she knew, including her family back in Ohio. Her 3rd job was at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers, where she worked as a topless dancer. Catherine didn't like the work, not one bit. But the money was good, really good. And if she was going to have any real shot at making it on Broadway, she needed that money for voice lessons and dance classes and all the other expenses that came with being a performer in New York. She lived in Manhattan, which was the most expensive borough in an already very expensive city. She knew she could save a lot of money if she moved to a cheaper neighborhood, and she had actually tried that when she first arrived. But her time in that less expensive neighborhood had ended in a traumatic experience. Her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The event had shaken her so badly that she seriously considered giving up on her dream entirely, packing her bags, and just moving back home to Ohio. But in the end, her determination won out. She decided to stay in New York and keep fighting for her dream. She just needed to be smarter about her living situation. And so she found her current apartment in a much safer part of Manhattan. To help with the high rent, she got a roommate. His name was David Hahn. He was 23 years old and was one of Catherine's friends from back home. At this very moment, as Catherine finished her makeup, David wasn't in the apartment. He had just gone out to get his car, which was parked a little ways down the street. He was going to drive her to work. As Catherine walked out of the bathroom and through the living room, she had to step over a black dog that was fast asleep on the floor. The dog wasn't hers, and it wasn't David's either. It turned out David was a part-time dog sitter, and this dog was just a temporary guest while its owners were away. Just like Catherine, David juggled multiple part-time jobs to get by. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment building. He and Catherine had a bit of a history. They had actually been a couple at one point and had dated for a little while. But these days, they were just friends, just roommates sharing an apartment to split the bills. Though, if Catherine was being honest with herself, she sometimes wondered if they should give their relationship another try. Thanksgiving had just passed a few days earlier. Instead of going back to Ohio for the holiday like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. It had been a really nice time, just the 2 of them. A big plus for David was that he knew about her job at Flash Dancers, and he didn't judge her for it. Catherine felt like most people would, so she really appreciated that about him. But there was one big hurdle that she saw to them ever getting back together. And that was the fact that David seemed to dislike almost every single man she ever met or dated. He was intensely jealous. With some of the guys, she could kind of see his point. There was a guy named Joe she had briefly dated who she'd met because he was a customer at the strip club. David had not liked him at all. But then there were other guys, like Paul. Paul was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym. She'd gone out with him a few times, but it was never very serious. He had always been perfectly nice and polite to David. But even so, David insisted that Paul was a creep. He just had a bad feeling about the guy. But right now, Catherine wasn't focused on her love life. She just needed to get dressed and get downstairs. She didn't want to keep David waiting in the car. So she went into her bedroom to finish getting ready, and that's when she heard the dog in the living room suddenly start barking. It sounded agitated, like someone was at the door. Curious, Catherine walked out of her room to see what was going on. A little while later, David Hahn was walking quickly along the sidewalk, heading for his parked car. It was a few blocks away, and he was a bit out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he was cutting it close on time, so he jumped in, started the engine, and drove back towards his apartment building. As he pulled up to the curb out front, he called Catherine's cell phone. But she didn't answer. He figured she was probably just running a little late, so he put his hazard lights on, got out of the car, and headed into the building to get her. He went up the flight of stairs to their second-floor apartment. As he walked down the hallway towards their door, he saw something that made him stop. It was the black dog. He was dog-sitting. Somehow, the dog had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway. David was confused. Then he saw his neighbor, a man named Brad Stewart, standing right behind the dog. Brad was holding a leash, and it was clipped onto the dog's collar. Brad was a guy David rarely ever spoke to, so this was a strange sight. For a second, Brad looked surprised to see David. And David was just trying to process why his neighbor was holding the leash of the dog he was supposed to be watching. Brad then explained that he had found the dog wandering around the hallway. He said he recognized it as David's and was just bringing it back. Brad told him he had just knocked on their apartment door, but nobody had answered. At this point, David understood why Brad had the dog, but he had no idea how the dog had gotten out of the apartment in the first place. He decided not to ask. He just thanked Brad, took the leash from him, and then walked over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The door was closed, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had locked it when he left or not. He opened the door and called out Catherine's name. There was no response. That was weird. She should have been ready and waiting for him. He stepped inside, leading the dog with him. He didn't see Catherine in the living room, but he did notice that the door to her bedroom was cracked open just a little bit. He walked over to it and called her name again. Still nothing. He tried to push her bedroom door open, but it wouldn't budge. It swung open maybe a few inches and then stopped hard. He could feel a heavy resistance on the other side, as if something big was on the floor, blocking the door from opening all the way. Now, with all these strange little things happening one after another, a feeling of worry started to creep into David's mind. A surge of adrenaline hit him. He put his shoulder into the door and shoved it open. He squeezed his head through the opening and looked inside. And what he saw in there made him immediately pull back. He turned, ran out of the apartment into the hallway, and he called the police. About 30 minutes later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz was walking up the stairs of an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city, the Upper East Side, was known for being extremely safe. Homicides were practically unheard of here. But based on the frantic 911 call, Getz knew that a potentially grisly murder scene was waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he got to the second-floor landing, he saw several other NYPD officers were already on the scene. One of them was talking to a young, skinny guy standing in the hallway. The man looked completely distraught and was clutching a leash attached to a black dog. Another officer came over and gave Detective Getz a quick rundown. He said the man was the victim's roommate, David Hahn. He was the one who had found the body and made the 911 call. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment, in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the apartment door. He wanted to see the scene for himself before he started questioning anyone. He pulled on a pair of disposable rubber gloves and carefully examined the doorframe of the apartment. Then he looked at the door itself. He didn't see any scratches, pry marks, or any other damage that would suggest a forced entry. So, he stepped inside. The small living room was a bit messy, but it didn't look like it had been ransacked or turned over in a robbery. The futon was pulled out into a bed, and there were some men's clothes scattered around, but it just looked like a normal lived-in space. Getz moved carefully through the living room, making sure not to disturb anything. He headed towards the back of the apartment to what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was located. The door was open just enough for him to squeeze through. When he stepped inside the room, he was met with a horrific sight. There was blood everywhere. It was splattered on the walls and on the furniture. The room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. A drawer from a dresser was pulled out, and women's clothing was thrown all over the floor. The mattress had been ripped completely off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor. In fact, the mattress was the very thing that had been blocking the door from opening all the way, and there, in the middle of the room, lying in a large pool of blood, was the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her to get a closer look. She was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. On the front of her t-shirt, there was a very clear and distinct shoe print, as if the killer had literally stepped on her chest. Her body was covered in at least a dozen stab wounds. There were also cuts on her hands and arms, which gets recognized as defensive wounds. They told him that she had fought back hard against her attacker. But the most severe injuries were to her neck. Her killer had slit her throat with such force that they had nearly decapitated her. To Detective Getz, it was immediately clear that this was not a random act of violence. This was a crime of pure rage, a personal attack. At that moment, Getz heard footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. The blocked door was making it difficult for everyone to move in and out of the bedroom. So, one of the first things the forensics team did was carefully pick up the mattress from the floor and lean it up against the wall, clearing the doorway. Now, the bedroom door could swing open freely. Detective Getz stepped back to give the forensics team space to work. He watched as they carefully lifted the shoe print from the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. They then found a second identical shoe print on her bedsheets, and they collected that as well. To Detective Getz, both prints appeared to be from the exact same shoe. And just by looking at them, he guessed they belonged to a man of average size. An idea sparked in the detective's mind. He stepped out of the bedroom and back into the living room. He quickly spotted a couple of pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor near the futon. He picked one up and looked at the sole. The tread pattern didn't match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom. But the size of the shoe, it looked to be about the same. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m., Detective Getz sat across from David Hahn at a table inside an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. He handed a bottle of water to David, who was currently his #1 suspect. The facts were simple and damning. There was no sign of forced entry at the apartment, which meant Catherine's killer either had a key or was led inside by someone who did. The murder weapon was a knife, and the attack was so brutal and savage that it screamed of personal motivation. Even though Catherine's bedroom was a mess, it didn't look like anything had been stolen. And because she was found partially undressed, a sexual motive was also a possibility. So, the detective's working theory was that the killer was a man who knew Catherine well, had easy access to her apartment, and had a personal reason to be angry with her. David Hahn fit that profile perfectly. Plus, it appeared he wore the same size shoe as the killer. As Detective Getz settled into his chair and took out his notepad, he did a quick, subtle scan of David's arms and hands. He was looking for any signs of a struggle. Cuts, scratches, bruises. He saw nothing. The detective found this interesting. Catherine had clearly fought for her life. Her killer would almost certainly have some marks on them. But Getz kept this thought to himself. Instead, he just leaned forward and, in a calm voice, asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking as he took a sip of water. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He said he had been at the apartment with Catherine that evening until about 6:40 p.m. That's when he left to go get his car so he could drive her to her 7 p.m. shift at Flash Dancers. But, he said, getting the car took longer than he thought it would. On his way, he had run into some of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them for a few minutes. He said after he got his car and drove back, he expected to see Catherine waiting for him on the curb outside their building. But she wasn't there. When he called her phone and she didn't answer, he went inside to get her. That's when he ran into his neighbor, Brad, in the hallway holding the dog. And then, he said, he went into the apartment and found Catherine's body. David told the detective that he called 911 right away and that it was right around 7 p.m. At this, Detective Getz paused his writing and looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he was only gone from the apartment for about 20 minutes. And in that incredibly narrow window of time, someone had managed to get inside, brutally murder Catherine, and then escape without being seen. It sounded like one of the most convenient and therefore unbelievable alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't let his skepticism show. He didn't want David to get nervous and stop talking. So he kept his tone sympathetic and asked David how long he had known Catherine. David explained that they had met a few years ago back in Ohio. They started dating, and he eventually followed her to New York to live with her. But not long after he moved, Catherine broke up with him and asked him to move out. David said he couldn't afford a place of his own, so he ended up sleeping in his car. Catherine had felt bad for him, so she eventually let him move back in, but on one condition: he had to sleep on the futon in the living room. Detective Getz's pen was now flying across his notepad. David wasn't just Catherine's roommate, he was her ex-boyfriend. An ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see her alive, and the one who discovered her body. Getz was now more certain than ever that he was sitting across the table from Catherine's killer. He told David that he was being incredibly helpful, but that he needed to step out for a moment to check on something. David agreed to wait. As Getz stood up to leave, he paused at the door and asked one last question. He asked David what his shoe size was. Without a moment's hesitation, David replied that he wore a size 10.5. Getz jotted that down and then left the room. What he didn't tell David was that he was going to get updates from the forensics team and the officers who were out interviewing David's neighbors. And then he was going to come back and use that new information to try and catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, around 3 p.m. the next day, Detective Getz was at his desk, feeling utterly exhausted. He was on his third or fourth cup of coffee. He had been up all night, going back and forth with David, who was still, at this very moment, sitting in an interrogation room down the hall. Getz had also been in constant communication with the forensics team and the other officers working the case. He still had a mountain of work to do before he could even think about going home to sleep. Right now, he was reviewing a new stack of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building. They had been asking the neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And just as Getz had hoped, the information they were gathering started to poke holes in David's story. David had claimed that he left the apartment around 6:40 p.m. and that Catherine was alive and well at that time. But two different neighbors reported hearing screams coming from the apartment well before 6:40. The man who lived in the unit directly above them said he heard 3 distinct screams at exactly 6:28 p.m. And the people who lived in the apartment right next door to them said they heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture being moved around even earlier, sometime between 5:45 and 6 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had called the police at the time. The noises had stopped pretty quickly, and in a crowded New York City apartment building, strange noises were a common occurrence. Then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had found the dog. Brad told the police that his encounter with David in the hallway happened sometime between 6 and 6:30 p.m. But David had said he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body around 7 p.m., a full 30 minutes later. Getz knew that eyewitnesses were often unreliable when it came to specific times. But still, all of these inconsistencies were adding up. It looked like David's alibi had some serious problems. The detective leaned back in his chair and took another sip of coffee. Just then, his phone rang. It was the forensics team. They had an update on the shoe prints found on Catherine's t-shirt and bedsheets, and the news was exactly what Getz was expecting. The prints were from a men's size 10.5. This was the exact same shoe size David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and immediately headed back to the interrogation room to have another talk with David Hahn. This time, when Getz sat down, he didn't offer David any water. He got straight to the point. He confronted David with all the new evidence. He told him that the killer's shoe prints were a perfect match to his shoe size. He told him that his neighbors had heard screams coming from the apartment before he had supposedly left. And he told him that Brad Stewart said he saw him in the hallway at least half an hour earlier than David had claimed. Getz leaned in close and told David that there were security cameras in the apartment building and that his officers were in the process of reviewing the footage. So, he said, if David had anything else to say, now was the time to say it. Getz watched David's expression change from exhaustion to pure fear. It seemed to be the first moment that David truly understood that the police did not believe his story for a second. After a moment of stunned silence, David insisted again that he did not kill Catherine. He begged Detective Getz to believe him. But when the detective just stared back at him, unmoved, David suddenly launched into a new story, a detail he had failed to mention at all during the nearly 20 hours of questioning. He said that Catherine knew a guy named Paul Cortez. They had dated for a while, but David had always thought he was a creep. David said Catherine had even told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So, David said, the police shouldn't be investigating him. They should be investigating Paul. To Detective Getz, this sounded like a desperate last-ditch effort to shift the blame onto someone else. But he knew he had to follow up on every lead, no matter how flimsy it seemed. So, he wrote down Paul's name and told David they would look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the night, David was still in the interrogation room. And outside the precinct, reporters from all the major newspapers were starting to gather. The next morning, the story of Catherine's murder was everywhere. Pictures of her smiling face were on the front page of all the local papers and on the morning news. The headline on the New York Daily News made Detective Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." The article reported that Catherine's family, who had flown in from Ohio to identify her body, had no idea she had been working as a topless dancer. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He was not convinced that Catherine's job had anything to do with her murder, but the media seemed determined to run with that angle. A media circus was the last thing he needed. His team was already under immense pressure to make an arrest, and now, with all the news coverage, they were about to be flooded with tips from the public, most of which would lead nowhere. Getz put the newspaper down and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He had ended the previous day feeling confident that David was his killer. He had even sent David home with strict instructions not to leave the city, fully intending to arrest him very soon. But first, he had to tie up the loose ends, and that meant ruling out any other potential suspects. And one of those potential suspects was sitting in the interrogation room right now. It was Paul Cortez, the man David had named. Officers had tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look down at Paul's shoes. They looked to be a pretty average size, maybe even a 10.5. Getz also checked Paul's hands and arms for any scratches or bruises. He did see one small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. When Getz asked about it, Paul explained that he had just pinched it between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken. He said he had heard about Catherine's death on the news and that he just wanted to help the investigation in any way he could. When Getz told him that they had gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just rolled his eyes. He said that David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they had dated on and off ever since. He said that at the time of her death, they were in an off phase, but he still cared about her deeply and hoped that one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't seen Catherine on the day she died, but he had spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon. He said that was normal for them, They still talked from time to time. He said he had actually tried to call her a second time later that day, but she didn't pick up. He didn't think much of it at the time. Paul then gave his alibi for that night. He said he went shopping with some friends and then went to a local bar to watch the Jets game around 8:30 p.m. Getz made a note to check his alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up as if he just remembered something important. He said there was a stalker, a guy named Joe, who had been a regular customer of Catherine's at the strip club. He said that months ago, this guy Joe had somehow gotten Catherine's personal phone number and started contacting her outside of the club. Around that same time, Catherine had been roofied during one of her shifts. Paul said he could never prove it, but he had always suspected that it was Joe who had drugged her. Catherine had cut off all contact with Joe after that, but the whole incident had really bothered Paul. He had tried to convince Catherine to quit her job, but she had refused. Paul admitted that he had even called Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her. Catherine had been furious with him for doing that and had stopped talking to him for weeks. Getz wrote all of this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this Joe. Paul said he didn't have his number, but he knew it would be in Catherine's phone. Because, he said, the last time he spoke to Catherine on the phone, on the very afternoon she died, she had told him something that surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. Detective Getz studied Paul's face, trying to detect any sign of deception. This whole story about Joe could just be a clever way for Paul to deflect suspicion from himself. But Paul seemed genuinely sincere. Besides, it would be easy enough to check Catherine's phone records to see if he was telling the truth. Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe he did need to start looking more seriously at the men Catherine knew from the strip club. The following afternoon, Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was sitting at his desk feeling increasingly annoyed. He had just hung up the phone with yet another reporter. He hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was keeping his comments brief. He turned his attention back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he had subpoenaed the day before. And they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. There were calls from both Paul and a man named Joe shortly before she died. So Getz had his officers bring Joe in for an interview. He asked Joe to explain why, after months of no contact, he had suddenly started calling Catherine right before she was murdered. Joe claimed he was just calling to check in, to see how she was doing, and to wish her a happy Thanksgiving. He said he was just trying to be friendly. But then Getz asked him point blank if he had ever roofied someone's drink. At that question, Joe's eyes went wide, and he stammered that he would never, ever do something like that. But his reaction told Getz a different story. The detective was almost certain he was lying. And so now, the entire investigation felt like it was wide open. Just a few days ago, Getz had been so sure that David was the killer, but now, all these other men from Catherine's life were emerging. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, his original suspect, David, was starting to look more and more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers at the hotel, and they all confirmed his story. They said he really had stopped to chat with them on the evening of Catherine's death. And while Getz had hoped the security camera footage from the apartment building would definitively prove David was lying about his timeline, it actually did the opposite. The footage showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up almost perfectly with his story of leaving around 6:40. Now, this didn't completely exonerate him. Based on the neighbors' accounts of hearing screams earlier, it was possible Catherine was killed before David left. But the building didn't have many cameras, and there were no angles that covered the hallway outside of apartment 2D. So, the footage couldn't prove, one way or another, who had gone into that apartment. Just then, his phone rang again. Getz picked it up, expecting another reporter. But this time, it was a member of the forensics team, and he could hear the excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they had just found something. Something big. Something they had completely missed during their initial sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics technician explained that when they had first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had moved the mattress that was blocking the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But in doing so, the mattress had covered up something that was on the wall behind it. It was a bloody handprint. It wasn't until a couple of days later, after they had processed everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress again, and that's when they finally saw it. Getz's face lit up. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Now, all he had to do was get handprints from all of his suspects and see which one was a match. But he quickly realized he had a major problem. By this point, some of his suspects had hired lawyers. And those lawyers were advising their clients not to speak to the police and certainly not to voluntarily provide their handprints. Getz couldn't legally force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so, the detective found himself in a frustrating catch-22. He needed the handprints to make an arrest, but he couldn't get the handprints without making an arrest. And at that point, the investigation stalled. Weeks went by, and Detective Getz grew more and more frustrated. There was nothing he could legally do to move the case forward. The case was still getting a lot of attention in the press, and to the public, it looked like the NYPD was fumbling the investigation. But then, on December 16th, almost 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the very news coverage that had been annoying Getz so much ended up giving him the key he needed to solve the case. That day, a woman called the NYPD. She was calling because of something she had seen on the front page of a New York newspaper. And what this woman had to say would lead Detective Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on all the evidence, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of the 27th of November 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer walked up the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew her schedule. They knew that at this very moment, she would be alone in her apartment, getting ready for her shift at Flash Dancers. The fact that she worked at that club was a source of intense jealousy for the killer. The thought of other men looking at her, of her giving her attention to anyone else, drove them into a silent rage. The killer had tried to win her over to make her his, but she had rejected him. And now, the time for talking was over. The killer walked quietly down the hallway to apartment 2D. They reached for the doorknob and turned it. It was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, they pulled out the knife they had hidden in their sweatshirt. But then, something unexpected happened. The black dog that was lying on the living room floor jumped up and started barking at them. For a brief moment, the killer considered turning around and leaving. But then, Catherine, alerted by the dog's barking, came out of her bedroom. She looked right at the killer, and she saw the knife in their hand. Catherine let out a scream and immediately ran back into her bedroom, the one room in the apartment that the killer was not welcome in. The thought of her trying to hide from them in her own private space sent a surge of anger through the killer. They charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the far side of her bed, trying to lift the mattress to use it as a shield. But the killer was too fast. They pushed past the mattress and grabbed her from behind. But Catherine fought back with everything she had. She thrashed and kicked, trying desperately to break free. They struggled violently, crashing into furniture and knocking things over. And then, the killer raised the knife and slit her throat. But even with that fatal wound, Catherine kept fighting. She fought with such ferocity that the killer had to brace themselves against the wall to keep their balance. And in the chaos of the struggle, with blood on their hands, the killer placed a hand against the wall, leaving a perfect, bloody print behind. Finally, Catherine collapsed to the floor. But the killer, still blinded by rage, got on top of her and began stabbing her again and again. When Catherine finally stopped moving, the killer stood up and ran out of the apartment. But as they got into the hallway, they realized that the dog had gotten out. The dog was still barking at them, on edge from the violence it had just witnessed. The killer wanted to get the dog back inside the apartment, but they couldn't get close to it. So instead, they just pulled the apartment door shut, trapping the dog in the hallway. Then, the killer fled the building, using a back exit where there were no security cameras. And for weeks, it seemed like they had gotten away with it. until their violent past finally caught up with them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who had no connection to Catherine was walking down the street in New York when a newspaper at a newsstand caught her eye. On the front page was a story about the murder case, and there was a picture of one of the main suspects. The woman was horrified. She recognized the man in the picture. He had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier. She had been too scared and ashamed to ever file a police report. But now, seeing that this same man was a suspect in a brutal murder, she knew she had to speak up. She called the NYPD and told them her story. The NYPD's Special Victims Unit used her accusation as the basis to arrest the man, and that man was Paul Cortez. Finally, with Paul under arrest, Detective Getz was legally able to get his handprint. And it was a perfect match to the bloody print found on Catherine's bedroom wall. David's suspicions about Paul had been right all along. He was a violent predator who had assaulted at least one other woman before he murdered Catherine. Cell phone tower data would later prove that Paul was in the immediate vicinity of Catherine's apartment building right before the murder. He had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, he waited. He saw David leave the building to go get his car, and then he made his move. He knew Catherine would be alone. David was only gone for about 20 minutes, but that was all the time Paul needed to get inside, commit the murder, and slip away unnoticed. Paul Cortez was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder. On Wednesday, the 23rd of December 2005, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.